Well, after a short break, the Big D is back with a UFC 277 edition on the Big D podcast. Before I bring in Billy, please subscribe, like, and share the Spunky Spectrum Sports YouTube page. You can see all my content getting back to work this week. Also, check out the Big D podcast on Spotify and Apple. In honor of me, the UFC decided to make a UFC 277 in Big D. That would be Dallas, Texas. Back for another UFC pay-per-view is Billy Ward. Billy, congrats on your on all your walks, because I don't remember anybody walking as hard as you have. You've done baseball, MMA. At this rate, you're going to be doing cycling next.
Yeah, I don't know about that, but football season is going to be a busy time until baseball ends. I'm now full-time at Action Network, so a lot of stuff coming, a lot of good content coming that way, especially on the MMA side, which, for anyone who listens to the podcast when I'm on knows MMA is clearly my biggest passion. So the more good stuff I can put out in that area, the happier I'll be.
Well, I bet you this weekend's main event will make you happy, because we see a rematch of one of the biggest, if not the biggest, shocks in UFC history, when Julianna Pena shocked Amanda Nunes last December. And thinking back to this fight, I'm still befuddled how Pena not just beat, but stunned the GOAT of women's MMA.
Yeah, it's really interesting because we've seen a couple of these immediate rematches after like a big title upset. We saw Matt Serra beat George St. Pierre way back in the day. George is clearly a better fighter, comes back, handles his business. We saw Chris Weidman knock out Anderson Silva when he was taunting and dancing around. They get a rematch. That's when Silva breaks his leg. So who knows how that fight would have gone. But it's interesting. We've talked about it. All these long title reigns have to come to an end at some point, and fighters might get complacent, might not have that same fire and that spark that they had before. And, they might just underestimate their opponent, because coming into that fight, Pena was 2-2 in her last 4 fights. Didn't really seem like she posed much of a threat to Nunes. Kind of seemed like we were all looking at Manon Fiorot being the next like legitimate challenger to Nunes. Then all of a sudden Pena comes out and does really, really well. So this is a super tough fight for me on like a DFS and handicapping side, because you're getting Nunes at a way, way better price at -275 than we saw her last time. But is she going to have that fire back? Is it just a fluke that she lost that first time? Or is she going to come in and think she's just going to roll through Pena again? Or did she actually lose a step? She has a daughter now. She's married. I can speak from experience that some of that real life stuff really takes the edge off as an MMA fighter. And Pena seems hungry and motivated. If both of these two are on their A game, I think it's Nunes pretty easily. But I'm also not all that confident that we ever see Nunes at her peak again.
Could part of Nunes' problem be she's getting up in age, and you reach a certain point in your career when you're great, and then you fall just a little bit, and you get a hungry fighter having that one great night. Think of Buster Douglas against Mike Tyson. I mean, sure, boxing, but Buster Douglas had that one great night in Tokyo. Could that have been Pena's one shining night? Or is Nunes' reign over?
Yeah, I mean that's the interesting question. And chronologically, she's not all that old. She's basically a year older than Pena. Nunes is basically a year older, I should say. So I don't think we're at the point where her body is aged to the point that her skills are physically declining, just from a pure physical standpoint. From a mental standpoint, though, you're right. When you're the champion, especially a long-running champion, you're fighting everyone's A game night in and or fight in and fight out. Everyone is bringing their best against you. Just you can't have your best every single time. That's not how it works. So if you happen to slip up a little bit when someone else is at the top of their game, that's going to be a problem. I think Nunes is likelier than not to just still be such a better fighter than Pena when she's at her peak, that I think she'll be motivated enough after the loss to get back there. And I think her head will be in the right space. And, her training camp had been thrown off before the last one, leaving American Top Team. Just had a kid, as I mentioned. There's a lot going on. I think it's likelier than not that she's back at her peak. Not that old, hasn't taken a ton of damage. I think, we probably see her regain the belt. Maybe they do a trilogy. I don't know. But I think we got a few more years of Nunes being at the top. but I'm not confident enough to lay minus 275. And looking at these DraftKings salary, at least from a tournament standpoint, I don't know if I'm confident enough in that to pay the 9,200 for Nunes either. Of course, for cash games, female MMA fight, just play both of them. Don't even think about it. But from a tournament standpoint, 9,200 is a lot. If she slips a little bit, that could be a good opportunity to catch a lot of the field on a high-priced player that bombs.
Especially because Nunes isn't really known as a knockout artist. She's known as a submission decision fighter. And we've seen women fighters, particularly older women fights. Guess what? A lot of those fights, except when we pick the $6,900 fighter, go to decisions.
Yeah, and we don't have those lines up yet. I think this one is probably a lot likelier than most WMMA fights to end inside the distance. Both have great submission skills, and Nunes doesn't have huge power by like men's MMA standard, but her knockdown rate is actually slightly above the overall UFC average, which obviously puts it way above the female average. So she certainly has some power. I don't think it's out of the equation. I think, if we're getting into the 4th, 5th round and they've both landed a ton of shots, I don't think it's too much of a stretch to see someone get a stoppage. But, I'm with you. I don't know if it comes quick enough or violently enough that she can pay off that salary, especially with all the bangers we have on this card. Because, man, looking up and down, there's a ton of people who bring a ton of violence on this one. I think we're going to see some bigger DraftKings scores than usual at the top of most contests.
Thank goodness, because the first half of the London card looked like a decision fight. I'm like, where the heck are the knockout artists? And then they all came. And then the main event lasted no time because the one guy was hurt literally when the fight started.
Yeah, 15 seconds on Aspinall. I will say, just to digress a little bit here, just another reason why for cash games, you just play both main event fighters when there's only 5-round fights. I was getting dusted in cash games, but only like 40-some% of the people had blades. He had the highest score on the night because of the quick win bonus. I instantly vaulted past all of them, cashed every cash game. Like, you can cover up a lot of mistakes by doing that. We're going to talk about this when we get to the co-main event. It's a little bit trickier when there's multiple 5-round fights. But for anyone who's listening who plays UFC DFS cash, which is, I know, a very small group, just play both 5-round fighters when there's only one. Like, every time I've not done that, it's came back to haunt me. So, yeah, just my little rant for the day.
I think back to that UFC light heavyweight title fight where literally both guys put up 1,000,000 points, and I'm like, oh no.
And guess who didn't play both of them on the biggest contest of his life because he was in a qualifier for the championship? Me. I thought the other one was going to be the better one to stack. And that was one, I guess this will be a good transition to our co-main, but that was one where playing all 4 fighters in the 2 5-round fights, because there was Shevchenko, Santos on that one as well, they all put up good scores. In a cash game, we don't need the best score from everyone. We just need solid scores. And I think this is probably another good opportunity to do that with Kara France and Moreno. Both guys throw a ton of volume. Both guys can wrestle a little bit, more so Moreno than Kara France. And both have good power. I think we see a ton of strikes in this one. And if it goes deep enough, we're going to see good scores from both guys. And there's just so much more activity at flyweight than some of the heavier divisions as well. But I'll let you set that fight up. I'm sorry. I jumped ahead of myself here.
No, that's okay, because we've got not just one title rematch, we've got another title rematch in the flyweight division where these two guys fought in 2019. So what do you think happens in the co-main event between Brandon Moreno and Kai Kara France? I mean, what's with all these fighters from Australia and New Zealand doing well in the UFC lately?
Well, a couple points before I get to breaking down the fight a little bit. I'm going to stop you there on calling this a title fight. I don't care what Uncle Dana says. Davison Figueiredo's been out of action for like 4 months. We don't need an interim title every time somebody takes a couple weeks off of training camp, guys. Like, this is not a title fight. It's a 5-round fight. They're going to put some gold thing around the winner's waist. I don't care. Davison Figueiredo's the 125-pound champ until proven otherwise. So, yeah, that's my first rant. Second one, yeah, I've noticed that too lately. I think like 5% of the adult males in Australia must be in the UFC at this point. They're just turning them out like crazy. And it's not, that populated of a place. It's not like it's China or something. So I don't know what's going on or what's in the water down there, but it's a good point. Kara France is another product of city kickboxing, and these guys are just dominating. They've got Adesanya, they've got Volkanovski, they've got the potential to add a third champion, in air quotes, with Kara France tonight. And, he's taken on Brandon Moreno, who's fought Davison Figueiredo 3 straight times with a win, a loss, and a draw in there. And, I've been impressed by Moreno, but I'm not quite sure in this one what we can say he's clearly much better at than Kara France. Kara France just fought Askar Askarov, or, one of the Eastern European grapplers, another stereotype we see in the UFC. Didn't get taken down too many times, clearly outstruck him. Kara France has huge power for 125er. His knockdown rate is 0.27 per round, with the UFC average being about 0.1. So, fighting in the smallest weight class, he gets almost 3 times as many knockdowns as the average UFC fighter. That's huge. And, it only takes one from him. We've seen him put people's lights out pretty quick. I get why Moreno's favored. He's probably a little bit better technical fighter in all areas. I just don't know if he can avoid that big shot from Kara France for 5 straight rounds. So right now we're seeing Moreno minus 205, Kara France 175 or so, depending on the book. And Kara France is cheap for DFS. He's only 7,300 with Moreno coming in at 89. I really don't like Moreno as a DFS play because even some of his wins, or a GPP play, even some of his wins haven't been super impressive. He didn't get to 100 points in his win against Figueiredo. He had a decision wins against Juicy Formiga, and he only scored 67 points. He just doesn't have that upside that Kara France have, where if Kara France wins, he either probably has a ton of strikes or a big knockout. So from a GPP standpoint, all over Kara France this week. I definitely want to be overweight the field. From cash, as I was saying before, I think this is one where we probably play all 4 of those fighters. There's enough uncertainty in the main event. And this one, just the activity rate should be pretty high. If Moreno is finding takedowns, I think he should go back to that well. I think Kara France will be able to get back up, which gives him more chances for takedowns. And I also think both guys are going to throw with a ton of volume. So this is one where I would not be shocked to see 150 plus combined points between the 2 fighters, which at the salaries we're getting, that's obviously something that we want.
How much do you look back to that 2019 fight where even though Moreno won, he didn't put up a lot of points. He only put up, 66 points. Now, true, it was a 3-round fight, but he only landed 91 significant strikes. So if you put that over 5 rounds, that would be 150. So I mean,
it'd be about 100 points if you project that out to 5 rounds. But there's a couple issues with doing that. One, the amount of volume and activity I can do in the first round is going to be a lot different than in the 5th. Like, these are human beings that get tired, right? Like, it's not that easy to just keep that pace up for 25 minutes. But also, both fighters have progressed since then. I think, obviously, we saw Brandon Moreno win a title by shocking Davison Figueiredo. Kara France, he lost one more time since then, but is on a 3-fight winning streak coming into that. So I don't think it's fair to say that these relatively young guys are the same fighters that they were. And we look at trends, the younger fighter and the fighter who won the previous fight has advantages even relative to betting odds in rematches. But Moreno's like less than a year younger, so I don't think that's a big thing here. It wasn't like a dominant performance the first time. I don't believe, I'm looking at it right. Yeah, he didn't land or attempt any takedowns. The striking was pretty close. Kara France outstruck him in the first round, and then Moreno outstruck in the second and third, but every round was within 5 or 6 significant strikes. It wasn't like he just starched him, being my point on this. It was a fairly close fight. So from a betting standpoint, if anything, I might say Kara France has made bigger strides since then than Moreno has. And to get a guy at plus 175, plus 185 in there who it was basically a toss-up in the first fight, I like that a little bit more than going with the favorite. You mentioned you thought someone might not be 100% coming in. Tell me more about that. I want to hear these rumors because you're ahead of me on
I've heard there's like an injury replacement potential for this fight. I don't know who it is, but hopefully we see a fight because it seems like once a month we get somebody WD for one of these fights. So hopefully we see this rematch in Dallas.
But you don't know which guy.
I have no idea who.
So it could just be that sometimes they just have a backup fighter on hand, even if there's no particular reason to be worried about that. It doesn't get a lot of press.
It might be because it's a title and an interim title fight. Sorry, I forgot to mention interim flyweight belt.
Yeah, so I don't know. I'm not putting too much stock in that unless I hear otherwise. But yeah, I trying to find the odds on their first fight. That would be interesting to see how that's changed since then. Give me 2 seconds on that one. because I don't think anything. Yeah, so Kara France was favored at -165. I don't think I saw enough in that fight to flip the odds that hard. I'm not saying I think Kara France should be favored here, but I think the odds are a little bit long on him. And I'm going to do a shameless plug here, but listen in on the Action Network sports betting podcast on Friday. I'll probably have a little bit more advanced thoughts on that by that time. But my early leanings as of Tuesday morning are Kara France is a pretty good value, both from a DFS and a betting standpoint.
So, like when Charles Oliveira, quote unquote, won when he was 1 pound overweight and didn't get to keep his belt, does that mean they're going to need an interim lightweight belt, or will he get a chance to reclaim his belt?
No, they've announced that one. I thought that was a little bit silly, but that wasn't just like the UFC making random decisions the way that the UFC likes to do. That was a boxing commission or athletic commission decision. But he's fighting Islam Makhachev for the title. It's technically listed as a vacant title, but to quote Chucky Olives himself, the champion has a name. It's Charles Oliveira, and I will hear nothing other than that until after that fight.
And if Oliveira wins that fight, then we get a super fight between Oliveira and Alex Volkanovski, which I can't wait to see.
Maybe, but then, if we do that, now are we talking an interim fight at featherweight as well, or interim title fight at featherweight as well? Probably Rodriguez and Emmett. I mean, that kind of makes sense, but can't fights just be for the number one contendership? Like, why do we have to call it a title fight? Like throw it as the main event on a fight night or a UFC on ABC card, something like that. That way we can still make it 5 rounds. Let it be for number one contender. I don't know. I just don't think we need 14 champions in 10 weight classes or whatever at any given moment. But that's just me.
Okay, so what fight are you looking forward to seeing other than the main event or co-main event on Saturday night?
Man, there's a ton. This actually looks like a really fun card. We just got a lot of like super violent guys. The obvious one is Derek Lewis back at home in Texas fighting Sergey Pavlovich. I don't know where we're really at with Derek Lewis. We've seen him get 2 or close to title fights a couple times. Hasn't really worked for him. But pretty much everyone below that level, he pulls off shocking upsets and knocks them the hell out. He knocked out Alexei Oleinik, who was supposed to lose that fight. That was when he gave the great speech, I believe. That might have been the prior Russian monster he fought before that. Because all they do is put him against these up-and-coming Russian monsters. Derek Lewis comes in, kind of chubby, looks all sloppy, not super technical, but he throws those hands and eventually finds one and knocks people out. But Pavlovich looks scary. This looks like a real test for him. I think he's got a little bit more of a well-rounded game. 5 inches in reach advantage, clearly in much better shape visually if you look at both of these men. So that one's super interesting. I don't have a strong take on who I think is going to win it yet. I do not think we spend a lot of time on this fight. I think this one sorts itself out in the first couple of minutes with somebody landing a big knockout or potentially Pavlovich getting him to the ground and finding a submission because he's got pretty good ground game as well.
Let's just say this. Derek Lewis's last 5 fights have all ended one way. Knockout. Either he's knocking out somebody or Lewis is on the canvas. So
well, and it's crazy too because there's another fighter who fits his profile really similarly, kind of a not visually in shape guy, frequently feels like he has no business winning a fight and then pulls a knockout out of nowhere, and that's Tai Tuivasa. So when they fought each other, I had no idea what to think. Like, logic would dictate in looking at pretty much everything about both of them that they should have lost a lot more fights than they have, but both these guys they've got that power. And as a heavyweight, sometimes that's all you need. The guy who can turn off the lights with one punch frequently finds a way to do so. But, Pavlovich has a lot of that himself. He's got a first round knockout in 3 straight fights. Other than his UFC debut against Alistair Overeem, all of his fights have been first round knockouts in his favor. Of course, like the level of competition for Pavlovich is a lot lower. Lewis has fought pretty much everyone. He's fought Curtis Blades, Francis Ngannou, Cyril Gane, Tai Tuivasa. So, it's a big step up for the Russian. Other than, again, when he fought Overeem, like who has to make their UFC debut against Overeem? That's ridiculous. Like what a tough situation to be in, but he's looked great outside of that. So super exciting fighter. That's one from a DFS standpoint. Just going to go to my Fantasy Labs optimizer. I'm going to tell it, I want one of these guys in every fight. I don't care which one. Let's see what happens.
Let me guess. On your Fantasy Labs article this weekend, that's going to be the swing fight, because generally whoever wins this fight is going to be a GPP winner.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this one, not only is it the likeliest to end in 12 seconds out of all the fights on the card, but it's also the betting lines are pretty even. Like I've seen it bounce around a little bit since I started looking, but right now DraftKings has it -110 both ways. I'm seeing Pavlovich a slight favorite, a couple other places. FanDuel has it a toss up. So, I like to target those closer fights, but also the fights that are likely to end early and produce a big score for somebody. And that is both of these this time. So that's an easy choice.
Yeah, I'm seeing on Bet's fight odds that Pavlovich is -125, Lewis +105, but all the numbers are pretty well close, so it's a pretty even
Yeah.
fight. But I'll tell you this: we don't have some of the prop bets. I wonder what the odds would be for a stoppage, whether it be a kick, knockout, or submission. I bet you they're going to be juiced up.
One of the offshores has it. You ready for it? -600 to end inside the distance. And -145 under 1.5. So,
What?
you're not sneaking that by anyone trying to bet that this fight doesn't go 15 minutes. But, probably not one that I'm willing to lay that kind of juice on, just because every now and then with the big boys, we see them empty the tank early and get tired. But still. So yeah, it's +400 to go to a decision, -600 to not do that, which I'm sure will be the longest odds on the card for a stoppage. But
Yeah. So before we talk about our favorite catch plays, I wanted to mention, what kind of shape do you think the UFC is as a whole? Because we've seen so many great fighters come of age. We've seen like Alex Volkanovski, Charles Oliveira. How do you think the UFC is faring? Because to me, it seems like the UFC just sort of stalled, but the last couple of years, think the UFC has regained its glory with fighting during the pandemic, and now having so many cards, going to London, going to Paris, going all over the world again. It seems like the UFC is the premier sport for people who like a little bit of violence.
yeah, so a couple points to that. It seemed like, in like the early days of the Ultimate Fighter, like the late aughts or whatever, and that when I was getting into the sport, I couldn't walk around my high school or anything without people wanting to talk about that. And it definitely faded for a while. They got some stars for a while. Those guys kind of aged out. It seemed like, maybe the UFC was just a flash in the pan. But, they did big shows every once in a while for, a few years in there. It's kind of like nobody talked about it outside of Conor McGregor fights. But yeah, I think you're absolutely right in that when the pandemic was going, they went and built an island pretty much so they could be the only game in town. And with sports betting getting so big, all of a sudden now there's only one sport you can bet on outside of like video games and Korean ping pong and stuff like that. So I think the combination of, sports betting and fantasy sports being big, and then the pandemic leaving the UFC as the only show in town was huge. Like it was great for me as someone, producing content around that, because there's just so many more eyeballs on what we were doing on that side, where a year or two before that, no one really cared. It was a niche sport. It was, probably on the level of like NASCAR or F1, where it had its fans, but it wasn't something kind of in the public discourse, where they've done a really good job of putting on enough exciting fights and, building a fan base during that time when they had all the eyeballs, that now they're just rolling. And I think they said, 2021 was the most profitable year ever. Not to get too deep into this, but obviously more of that money should go to the fighters because it wouldn't be happening without them. But if you're the UFC, you go, hey, no one fighter stops the show here. Like they lost McGregor basically, more or less haven't had McGregor consistently for 3 or 4 years now, and are doing just as much revenue as they did even with him. So they've proven that people are going to come out for those 3 letters without needing to really build stars who are standout stars on their own right. And these other organizations have tried to challenge him on that, and so far, the only way to be profitable is to kind of market yourself as a secondary league to the UFC, the way Bellator and PFL has, where they're not directly competing for top talent. They're saying, hey, we're going to put on some entertaining fights, kind of like college football, where we know it's not the best guys, but it can still be fun in its own right, and we're not going to go head to head with the big leagues.
Yeah, and also you get people stall for entertainment. They want to see
Right.
Actually, they want to see Amanda Nunes. They want to see Alex Volkanovski, Charles Oliveira, all these men and women fight, get big time performances, and then earn the cheers and applause.
And they've just done such a good job where it doesn't need to be Amanda Nunes, right? It could be whoever the name is, and people are still going to tune in. That I think that's where they've done a much better job than boxing, where boxing is really heavily dependent on the name on top of the card, where the UFC, there's going to be, 11 to 15 fights in a night and probably some good ones in there. So it doesn't have to be just because I've heard of this guy. It's like, hey, we'll watch the UFC fights. Probably something awesome is going to happen at some point on the card, even if it's two people we haven't heard of. So they've really made it about, the UFC rather than any individual fighter, which for the fighter's sake is not ideal. But if you're the UFC, that's perfect.
So, from a DK standpoint, what is going to be your cash strategy? Because to me, I really want to jam in all four of the title fighters, but how do you go with the rest of your lineup? Because there are a couple of guys I really like in the 94 and $9,500 range with Morales and Akalev.
Ankalaev.
Nikolaev, I love those Russian names. They always annoy the crap out of me.
So real quick on that top end, I'm not sold on Ankalaev being a good play today. This week, his last 3 fights, he hasn't gone over 82 points on DraftKings, and he's kind of reserved himself to like, I'm going to take it easy. I'm going to make sure I win this fight. I'm not going to put myself out there. And Anthony Smith is real dangerous on the ground. So I think if Ankalaev gets takedowns, he's not going to be overextending, trying to hit him too hard or, beat him up with ground and pound. I think it's going to be more of a slower control-based strategy, kind of like we saw against Thiago Santos, which 5-round fight only scored 80 points. Morales, on the other hand, ton of volume, ton of activity. Only seen one UFC fight from him, but he was throwing caution to the wind, came out super aggressively. He fought Trevin Giles in his first fight, which is honestly probably a tougher opponent than he has this time. So I think Morales is a great play. But then if you're playing those 4 fighters like we talked about, then you got to find somebody stupid cheap to make that lineup work. So I'm not 100% sure that I'm going to play all 4 of the top fighters. I think if I was going to leave anyone out, it would maybe be Pena. I don't really have a strong take on that fight, though, and that doesn't really help the salary situation. So little early for me on that side, but yeah, I think finding someone on the cheaper end that you can pair with Morales if you want all 4 fighters, or go 2 of the people more in the middle range would be a good strategy too.
Yeah, because I really want to try and get all 4 title fighters because it'd be weird to have like 180 points and then like everybody's like 300 and I'm like, well, I've got all 4 fighters left and you've got 2.
Yeah, and it's tough because either like they both have reasonable shots of ending early. Like Cara France has good power, and so does Julianna Nunes. In that fight, both girls have both women have some submission ability. So it's not a lock that all 4 of them end up as good plays, but it's definitely something to consider. But it does make the rest of your lineups challenging if you want an expensive fighter.
Yep. And but it is only Tuesday, so we've got some time between now and Saturday night. So thank you.
Real quick, I was gonna say not so much for cash games, but from a GPP standpoint, Blood Diamond is having a second fight, and he looked real bad against Jeremiah Wells in his first fight. But Jeremiah Wells is like legit one of the handful of best grapplers in the UFC, and that is not so much the case when he's fighting Orion Kosuke. So on the cheaper end, from a tournament standpoint, I think there's some good options out there. I'm not quite sure who it's going to be from a cash game standpoint, but yeah, everyone tune in. My article usually comes out Friday afternoonish over at Fantasy Labs. The article is free. The projections are behind the paywall, but you can definitely at least get a glimpse on. I usually try to find that one cheap fighter that I use for cash games, so he or she will certainly be highlighted.
Yeah, and hopefully that fighter will last longer than your chief fighter did last week.
Yeah, it didn't always work out for me, but hey, I still cashed all my contests, so I'm counting it as a win.
Yeah, so thanks for hopping on, Billy. Wish you well. Hopefully things go well this week. And by the way, if you're a big time UFC fan, this is the last week of the UFC DraftKings World Championship, so a lot of money is going to be at stake in a big D on a Saturday night.
All right, thanks, Dylan. Pleasure as always.